morning. I am Chris, your host of the Two Nerds podcast, and I am here to talk about games with everybody. I just wanted to say thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Today is going to be pretty much an introductory. I'm going to tell you who I am, let you know a little bit about me, kind of let you know what some of my favorite things are when it comes to gaming, and what some of my least favorite things are. I'll try to avoid the negative stuff and focus more on the positive. Outside of that, this is a podcast that's going to focus on games and war games. So we're going to have some Warhammer talk and some Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder and all kinds of stuff. So if you like games, this is hopefully going to be something you're going to enjoy. I will branch out occasionally and talk about things outside of gaming. You know, I'm a father, I'm self-employed, so I've got a lot going on in my life. So there are going to be times where we talk about things that aren't gaming related, but I'll try to keep it pretty lighthearted and fun for everybody. First thing we want to do is introduce myself. Like I said, I am Chris. I own Vorpal Gaming in Knox, a small game store. Been around for about 2 years now, and it's been an adventure. Before that, I owned a music store with my brother, and that unfortunately was not successful for a variety of reasons. One of them was just location. The other was I just wasn't as prepared then to deal with the reality of being a business owner as I am now. That is a huge commitment, and while I knew it was a huge commitment, you don't really understand it until you do it or you've been around people that do it. So that's kind of who I am. I spent 15 years in the Army. 5 of it was active. The rest of it was National Guard. I got stop-loss, did 2 tours in Iraq. So I'm an infantry veteran. Was in for a long time. And believe it or not, that's not what got me into wargaming specifically. I was into it in high school. I started playing Warhammer 40,000 with a friend of mine who also enlisted. We used to have huge games on a pool table late at night, start at 8 o'clock and get done at 8 in the morning. It was a good time. There were a handful of us that used to play, Mike and I think Dallas and Josh, and occasionally the other Josh, the lesser known Josh. So it was a good time. A lot of fun was had. Also got started on Blood Bowl pretty young, around that same age, 16, 17. Had a buddy from a nearby small town that used to come and play Dungeons and Dragons with us, and he was into Blood Bowl, so it was kind of one of those where he was like, hey, here's how you play this game, and I loved it. So gaming, that's kind of how I got started in gaming. Plus, as a young kid, really young, I remember my uncles and my older brother and everybody not necessarily playing, but enjoying Dungeons and Dragons. I don't remember them ever playing together, but I know they all did it separately at some point in their lives. So I remember having the old paperback basic Dungeons and Dragons and advanced Dungeons and Dragons books. So that's kind of what got me into role-playing. That and Hero Quest, really cool board game published by Milton Bradley. It's a Games Workshop game with Citadel miniatures, and Milton Bradley put it out. It's kind of like an intro to D&D, almost like making Diablo a tabletop game. Cool concept, really neat, a lot of fun. In fact, I actually managed to pick up an old box for like $100 on eBay, and the kids love it just as much as I did. So that's always a good time to be able to sit down with young kids like 7, 8 years old and play effectively Dungeons and Dragons with them. So really good time. Gaming's important to me because it's an escape, for one. It's my way of kind of coping. I do a lot of things to cope with stress, and I've had to do a lot of things, especially since getting out of active duty. I've had to really figure out my life and figure out what works for me. I spent a good portion of time just kind of floating and drinking and kind of doing nothing, just stagnating. And that wasn't good for me. I got real big into lifting weights and exercise, and that helped out a lot. And I also got back into gaming after a big break. I didn't do a lot of it while I was active duty. We had a lot of training time because of deployments and such. So, I mean, I did have a group of friends. We were nerds. We did play some Dungeons and Dragons together, but the tabletop aspect, the Warhammer, the war games, that didn't happen nearly as much. I had a couple buddies that did that. We would play occasionally, but not like I used to. And I know part of that is just becoming an adult. So, yeah, one of the reasons it's so good for me is because I like the escape. It's fun. Fun is good. I like the competitive aspect of it. Not necessarily the hyper-competitive aspect of it, but the when games are close and tight and it's a good game, that's the most enjoyable time. Don't get me wrong, I like blowing people out of the water occasionally just as much as people like blowing me out of the water occasionally, but by far the most fun games are the ones that are really close when it comes to war games. Role-playing games are always fun for me, and they're important to me, again, because of the escapism that comes with them, but also because, like, as a kid, I used to tell myself I was going to be an actor. Obviously, that didn't pan out. Life happened. I made different choices, and I just decided that that was not something I could pursue if I wanted to live the life that I wanted to live. So, didn't ever follow that dream, and that's okay. D&D is kind of like my way of getting that itch scratched, being able to act it out a little bit. Don't come in costume. I don't get all dressed up for it, but just being able to put myself into another character's shoes is really nice. And just kind of, like I said, scratches that acting itch. We're going to talk about some of my favorite games. I'm going to break them down into different types. We're going to talk about role-playing games, and then we're going to talk about war games, and then we're going to talk about traditional games. And traditional games would be like the Monopolies and the Risks and the Clues and all that stuff that almost everybody's played. And then we're going to talk about niche games. And niche games, we're going to be all-encompassing. That's going to be non-standard games or non-traditional games that aren't role-playing or war games. That's going to be a really broad category of games, and I understand that. We're going to be talking about games like Smash Up or Munchkin or even games like Hero Quest, even though that could potentially fall under the role-playing game as well. So it's just going to be a big group of games, and we're going to talk about what my favorites are from each group and why they're my favorites. And, unfortunately, I'm not able to just pick one favorite. I can't do it. I love games so much that I have to pick multiple favorites because there's different things I like about each one. We're going to start with role-playing games, and, obviously one of my favorites is, Dungeons and Dragons, but I think a lot of that is because that's what I grew up on. That's what I learned to play, not necessarily first, but most. It's that traditional medieval fantasy, at least it was then. It's a lot more high fantasy now than it used to be, but I think that's kind of just the trend of most role-playing games, is to get a lot more high fantasy and a lot less gritty, real. Not that any of them were ever realistic. You're still casting Fireball, but they're a lot more forgiving and a lot more new player friendly than any of the other games, or older, any of the older games were, for the most part. I'm having coffee. I grew up reading The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, so it was kind of like a way to tell my own Tolkien-esque story. So that's a big part of why D&D has always been one of my favorites in that genre. Pathfinder is good. I'm learning 2nd edition now, so I don't have a firm opinion on it yet, but it is really good, especially when D&D went into 4th edition and then 3.5 kicked over 3.5 had its own host of issues. Rules bloat definitely got bad towards the end of 3.5, and that's okay. You know, 5th edition I've enjoyed a lot. I know a lot of people are like, well, we don't have enough options. And I just think, man, I grew up playing a game where you played a magic user, an elf, a dwarf, a thief, or a fighter, and that was it. Like, I don't know what you're complaining about just because you can't be a pretty pink princess with a unicorn horn and a rainbow shimmering cape, you know, and you're not some weird demonic entity. Who cares? Like, just play the game. Just because you want to feel special and unique in everything you do doesn't mean everybody needs to bow and kowtow to that. You know, it's the, I don't know. I'm kind of getting off on a tangent. It's just one of the things that frustrates me about modern Dungeons and Dragons is that they're generally just adding things to make everybody feel individual and unique, which I know people say more choice is always better, but that's not always the case. There is such a thing as too much choice, and I go back to 3.5 with its terrible rules bloat towards the end. There is definitely such a thing as too many options. But I've enjoyed 5th edition. It's kind of some weird combination between the old 2nd and 1st edition rules and 3rd edition rules. There's some option without it being overwhelming, and there is definitely some structure or some rigidity there. Sorry, I'm still waking up, and this is my actually this is my quarantine project, was to get this started. I've been wanting to get a podcast going for a while to go with my blog, and just haven't been able to make the time. And now that I've got 2 weeks of quarantine, I am going to go ahead and make the time because that's all I've got. So that's my favorite role-playing game in the fantasy genre. If we look at non-fantasy, I think Shadowrun's one of my favorites. It blends near-future science fiction with, oh gosh, everything really. There's some fantasy in there. There's cyberpunk elements. I mean, it's really what it is a cyberpunk game with fantasy elements, I guess would be a better way of putting it. That is actually, I think, the first role-playing game I ever learned how to play in terms of just without the help of my brother, without the help of anybody else, just sat down and read the rule book and taught other people how to play. The rules are wonky. It focuses on strictly 6-sided dice. Character creation is slow, and the game is unforgiving. The newer edition is, I think it's 6th that they're in now, is a little bit more forgiving. I haven't got to play it yet, but I know my brother ran a table in our store for a bit, and he had said that it's a little bit more forgiving and easier to wrap your head around. And that game was unnecessarily difficult. And I don't necessarily mean from its mortality standpoint. I really just mean from the rules and mechanics were so convoluted, it was just unnecessarily difficult. That being said, I enjoy it. I don't like running it. I like playing it. But unfortunately, I never get to play it because nobody else likes running it either. So everybody wants to play, nobody wants the GM. And that's, I think, the problem a lot of groups have. So, and then there's some science fiction games out there, and by and large, I've been unimpressed with most of them. I played Traveler a long time ago, seemed cool. Played D20 Modern and D20 Future. Not a fan of the D20 system for anything other than fantasy. It just feels kind of dumb, you know? Having a pool of hit points, and then you get shot by a bullet, and it's just like, okay, I know hit points are abstract, but like I just got shot by a bullet. At least with sword fights, you can kind of pull that abstract out to where maybe you just got punched, or you know, it's like fatigue setting in. But when somebody just pulls a gun out and shoots you, there's no fatigue. You're either shot or you're not. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's fatigue, but not in the same way as a melee or a fist fight or a sword fight. So that abstract has always been difficult for me, which is one of the reasons why I enjoyed Shadowrun, is because guns were guns, and like a bullet to the brain is a bullet to the brain, whether you had a new character or a character who had been running for a year. So the science fiction ones, by and large, leave me unsatisfied. I've played some of the 40K games, and they're okay. I mean, they're not really sci-fi; they're fantasy in a sci-fi skin. Um, so there's that. Outside of that, though, I've played a few. One of my buddies was big into Alternity, I think it was called, when I was active duty. Brad, thanks for getting me into that, buddy. It was a fun game for what it was, but again, it felt kind of like fantasy in a sci-fi skin as opposed to an actual sci-fi game. But that could have just been the way he ran it too, because I didn't spend too much time reading the rule book. I just kind of rolled dice and played. Uh, So that would be probably my role-playing games, though. It's probably Shadowrun and Dungeons and Dragons for sure. The Cthulhu one's fun, although I've only gotten to play it once. I would be interested in playing it again. It was a blast the one time I did play it. One of my little brothers, his buddy Jacob, ran a game for us. So that may be a thing that I look at doing at some point. That'd be pretty cool. Like I said, I had a good time with it. And you go into a game like Cthulhu with the expectation that everybody dies at the end. Like, that's just kind of, that expectation's already set. Your character creation isn't as painful as games like Shadowrun. And that was one of the downsides to Shadowrun, is spending 2 hours making a character only to have it die, like 2 sessions in. But we're going to talk about war games. And I'm actually gonna, I skipped a genre, but we're gonna talk about sports games and war games in here. Mostly because a couple of my favorites are made by the same company. And it's pretty obvious we're gonna talk about Warhammer 40K. Definitely one of my favorites. It has its flaws for sure. But there's a large variety of armies. Each one generally has its own strengths and weaknesses. There's some downsides to that game. It definitely has some balancing issues, and by far, it's got to be one of the most difficult games to balance. When you have as many different factions and sub-factions as they do, and so there's a lot going on. There's a lot of moving pieces. One of the other issues the game suffers from is unless you're in a competitive environment, players get bored pretty easily waiting for their turn, because it's I take my whole turn, you take your whole turn. So not everybody's engaging with the game all the time. So it's one of those where it's okay, but it's a fun game. It's a really fun game. The models are fantastic. Citadel still makes some of the best miniatures on the market in terms of detail. So a little bit about my 40K history. I started with Orcs back in 3rd edition. Played into 4th. Orcs got the nerf hammer real bad. I think it was in 4th. And I just kind of stopped playing. Jumped over to Fantasy. Had fun with Fantasy for a few years, and then just stopped playing altogether, and then got back into 40K when not reopened, but when we decided to move over to games. And immediately just went back into Orcs and had fun. It was a good time. But no, it's a great game. It's got like I said, its issues. There's a lot of tryhards. There's a lot of dudes who think that they're just the best at it, and then they play people who are actually good. There's a lot of saltiness. It's one of those where if you have a good community, it's a lot of fun. If you have a toxic community, just like anything else, it's not fun at all. It's just, I think that's what makes the game, though, is your community, for sure. Generally, I've got a great community. I've got a couple players in my community that they're not bad people, but they do get super salty about silly things. They're not toxic. They're just I don't know, hyper competitive, and then not that good, and that's an odd combination. But that being said, I mean, it's a, I don't know, fun game. I'm kind of all over the place again. There's a big story. behind it. I don't really read the books that much. I'm not a big lore guy. I'm not going to sit here and tell you the history behind every orc clan or every this or every that. Don't really care. I just play the game. Like, some of the books are good. I've read a few of them. But I don't necessarily enjoy how the game is starting to conform to the books, because when I started playing, there were no books. I don't think those started coming out until like 2001, 2002. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was. And with all the books coming out, I've noticed that the game is starting to get pushed in line with the books as opposed to the books going in line with the game. Um, you know, and it's not a bad thing necessarily. It's just I don't care about the books that much, so I just want to play the game, and I'd like to see like the game get rebalanced, which it looks like it is. It looks like Ninth Edition is a big rebalancing, and yeah, it's a great game. I'll probably do one whole episode dedicated to 40K in some degree. You'll probably get episodes talking about. Sorry, that coronavirus is messing me up. You'll probably get episodes talking about different factions and stuff, but this is by no means strictly a 40K channel. This will cover other things as well. I think Necromunda is another one of my favorites. It's basically old Warhammer, but at squad level, except instead of 40K dudes, you're using gangers. A lot of fun. Really, really in-depth roster management and progression. So it's like one part RPG, one part tabletop strategy, kind of like a tactical RPG video game. Definitely one of my favorites. Blood Bowl, though, is where I was going next. And that's the sports game. I've played a few different sports games, and none of them are Blood Bowl. Tried Mantic Games Dreadball. It's not a bad game. It just feels like it's missing something. And maybe the newer versions aren't as bad. I played it when it first dropped, so it's been a few years. And then I did Impact. Impact does a game called Elf Ball. And conceptually, it's really interesting, but the rules are really, they're kind of dumb. But to be fair, Impact is a miniatures company, and then they made some rules to go with some miniatures kind of thing. Like the models came first, and then the rules rather than the rules and then the models. So I don't think the rules were necessarily a big deal to him. And I don't think they are still. Like, I don't think he cares one way or the other. Nice dude. Talked to him a few times. I work with him. He's one of the companies I carry in my store. Super nice guy. Just don't think he's invested in the rules aspect of what he does as much as he is the miniatures. And his miniatures are phenomenal. So, shout out to Tom. You make great miniatures, buddy. And he's actually right here in Indiana with me, which is kind of cool. I didn't realize that until, I don't know, probably 6 months ago. But yeah, still not Blood Bowl. Blood Bowl is by far the best sports game I've played on a tabletop. It's I use the term football loosely because it's a sorry. I use the term football loosely because to me it's a lot more like rugby, but I don't know as much about rugby as I do about football. So to somebody familiar with both sports, it may look more like football than rugby. Who knows? But it's all the old Warhammer fantasy races in a glorious game of football in which you can actually kill your opponents, and it's roster management and silliness, and oh my gosh, is it glorious. We do leagues in the store. I was doing 2 a year, but I think I'm going to shrink it down to 1 a year, but I'm going to lengthen the season. So rather than doing 2 short leagues, I think I'm going to do 1 long league. And maybe 1 or 2 actual tournaments. But it's a great time. Games take about 2 hours, hour and a half to 2 hours if you've got 2 people who know how to play. And also the teams you pick are going to determine how long it takes, believe it or not. dwarf teams tend to make for longer games, and then high-scoring teams tend to make for quicker games because your turn is based off of like getting touchdowns and stuff like that. So they actually just released a new rule set for that, fixed a few things that were kind of dumb about the older editions, like the way agility checks worked. Agility checks were super silly because it was like if you would take your agility and then subtract it from 7, and that would be your target number. So if your agility was 3, 7 minus 3 is 4. Your target number is 4, but most things that you need to do will have a +1 modifier, so it's really a target number of 3. And then it was just a lot of modifiers you had to memorize at that point. It was just silly. It was silly, and it was an old rule system that had barely changed from like 1996 to 2016, I think. No, 2020. Yeah, this year it just changed. So you're talking about a 20, 25-year-old rule system and it's just a subtle tweak where instead of having an agility and then finding your target number by doing this and this, they just give you a target number. So basically your agility is a 3+ instead of a 4, and then you modify it with a +1 modifier. And it just makes life so much easier. I've only played one game of the new edition, got my ass handed to me. Not saying I would have won, but Matt, I'm sure you would agree, that game was all extremes in terms of die rules. He got the blitz, and then the other version he got the one when you're kicking the ball and you can make a free move, and the one when you're receiving the ball and you can make a free move, and back-to-back drives. Yeah, it was just silliness. Like, my games against Matt usually go that way, though. I can't do anything. And I think Alex was there too, old tan-head Alex, and that's not a racial thing. It's just he has red hair, and my son decided to start calling him tan-head because of his red hair. So he was there, and he was just like, dude, I can't believe how inept you are at rolling dice. And I'm just like, yeah, cool, man. Like, it's the way it is. And then I think it was like turn 6 or 7. I was just like, all right, dude, I got to stop. Like, I can only roll double ones so many times before I am just done with the game. And, afterward it was funny, but during the game it was not funny at all. But that is Blood Bowl. Like, if you need anything but a 1, the only thing you can count on is getting 2 of them back to back. So, yeah, great game if you like roster management and league management and leveling up your players and getting new skills. Whole lot of fun. Fantastic game. If you're not into that stuff, then, I guess just fuck off. Like, sorry, it's not for you. I don't know if I can say that. I guess I just did, and it's my podcast, but... So yeah, if you've got other sports games that you've played, let me know, because I do enjoy sports games like Blood Bowl. They are fun. And then traditional games. And these are games that you probably grew up playing in your house, or your mom and dad played, or anything like that. We always played a lot of cards in my house, so I'm a big fan of spades. Hearts is okay. Learned how to play Pinochle at a young age. That was a fun game. Risk is okay. It just takes kind of a long time. Outside of that, what is it? I don't know. Monopoly. Like, all these games, they're okay. They're fun. They have their place. They're a little bit, like, a lot of them are easier for kids to learn. Like, we just played Life with my daughter not that long ago, and that game is long and painful, but she loves it, so that's all that mattered. And then my girlfriend, she always laughs at me when I'm like, hey, let's play a game, and she's like, no, all you have is weird games. She wants to play Clue, and she wants to play Monopoly and stuff like that, and all I have are weird games, which is fair. To her, they probably are weird. So I don't know that I necessarily have favorites there. I know that I enjoy them to some degree, but I don't enjoy them the way I enjoy a lot of other games. And then if we look at like niche games, I mean, and again, that's a broad category of games at this point. Because like Betrayal at House on the Hill, super good game. Kind of like a Cthulhu board game where you explore a mansion and then like the haunt begins, and once the haunt begins, somebody or nobody or everybody becomes the bad guy. Um, Man, I've had a lot of fun playing that game, and I've probably only played it 5 or 10 times total. It's been a blast though, just a straight up blast. Kids. My daughter is 9, and she enjoys it immensely. Um, have to kind of help her with a few things, but generally speaking, she's good with everything. The only thing I really have to help her with is just learning how to sit down and focus to play the game. But I think that's all kids. Definitely, game time with kids is its own adventure. But Smash Up's another fun one. It's a card game. You get 2 factions. You shuffle the factions together, and then that forms your deck. And then you have bases, and you put minions on the bases, and then whoever has the strongest minions on the base wins. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that's generally how it works. The game itself is really easy to learn, especially with just the base set. It doesn't start getting weird until you get into some of the expansions. The Cthulhu set is fun. It's a lot of fun. The Munchkin set is not so good. But there's a lot of different mechanics and stuff going on there. Like I said, it's real easy to learn, not so easy to master. Like, you find out that different factions have good combos and stuff like that. Just a lot of fun. Not a fun game to teach somebody how to play, though, because it's one of those where you have to try to not just, like, beat that ass just so you can go slow and teach people how to play. And it takes probably 5 or 10 games before you really get what's going on. Because you just have all these different factions and all these different combinations that can happen. So yeah, no, that's a great one. Gosh, 5 Minute Dungeon's a good one. Let's see. There's Catan's another one. Have a lot of fun with. My mom likes that one a lot. So there's a lot of games out there, more than I could ever discuss. I just wanted to touch on what some of my favorite ones are. So I think one of the best parts of my job and one of the best parts of what I do is just being able to explore new games and find new games. Having people go, hey, I found this game, let's learn it. One of my other guys that comes in, his name is also Alex, but he's not Tanhead. Came in and he was just like, hey, I want to learn this game, let's learn this game. And for a long time, I was just like, I don't know, because it was a historical war game, and I have largely avoided those. I have avoided those because I know how the battle ends. Why would I play it on a tabletop? And that's kind of been my mindset going into it. And finally, he was just like, Chris, don't look at it like that. Think about it as either rewriting history or you're just playing one of the little smaller battles that happened in the war. So it doesn't necessarily matter who wins, so on and so forth. And he was like, and there's campaigns for like rewriting the war and stuff. So finally, I kind of said, all right, we'll check it out. And that game is bolt action, and holy smokes, am I glad that I did. I'm gonna probably do. I don't know that I have time to go into it now. I don't want to just talk about bolt action for a couple minutes. I want to talk about it for a bit. Because there's a lot of things that go along with it. Because there's like the Weird War II variant, Conflict 47, and then there's the fantasy variant, which is Warlords of Erewhon, which is just like nowhere backwards. So I kind of want to touch on all of them a little bit. So that's probably what we're gonna do next week. Let's go ahead and let's talk it out now. We got some time. So Bolt Action was a super fun game. It could be any setting, it doesn't matter. As I've seen, like the fantasy setting and the pseudo sci-fi weird war setting. One of the most interesting aspects about the game is the order dice mechanic. So most war games do one of two things. Either I take my whole turn, then you take your whole turn, or we just alternate activating units, like Necromunda or BattleTech. Like you just activate a unit, then I do, then you do, then I do. Well, what Bolt Action does, and all of the variants, is every unit that you have gets an order die, and then all the order dice get put into a bag, yours and mine. And then we shake it up, and we pull out a die, and whoever's die it is gets to place that down and activate a unit. So it's possible for you to activate 2 or 3 units before I even activate one, but it's also possible for us to just alternate. There's some variety without it feeling overbalanced or unbalanced, not overbalanced. Can you overbalance a thing? That is too balanced. Silly. So it's you have this ability to choose what unit you want to activate, and then there's also reactions that can happen. So like if I activate a unit to shoot at your unit, you can use a die. You can just pull one of your dice out if that unit has not activated, and you can use that to react. And there's different reactions. I think in regular Bolt Action, you can just go down when you're being shot at, which just makes you harder to hit. Whereas like in Conflict 47, you have a couple different reactions. You can do the firefight reaction, which lets you shoot back, and then your shots are all resolved simultaneously, which is kind of cool. It lends to a game where both players are interacting with the game and with each other throughout the whole game, which makes it much more enjoyable for both players. One of the issues that 8th edition Warhammer suffered from was alpha strikes, and that was basically turn one, I'm just going to drop it in you super deep and give it to you, and that's the way it's going to be, because that's the way I like it. See what I did there? So it's just like, you don't get those alpha strikes so much. Terrain has very interesting rules. A lot of it is just because there's no armor saves in Bolt Action, and I don't think there are in Conflict 47, but in Erewhon there are. But there's no wound rolls in Erewhon. You hit, and then I roll resolve. Yeah, I think it's a resolve check. So it's kind of a weird difference, but so in Bolt Action and Conflict 47, you have the similar mechanics where if I'm shooting you, I roll to hit. So if everybody hits on 3s, first and foremost. So with everybody hitting on 3s, it just makes the game a lot more balanced, because you don't have orcs, for example, that hit on 5s when they shoot, but then Space Marines, which hit on 3s when they shoot. You have everybody just hits on 3s, and then everything just modifies your hit roll. So like if I go down, I'm -2 to hit, so your 3 gets bumped to a 5. If I'm in light cover, it gets bumped 1 more to a 6. If I'm in dense or heavy cover, it gets bumped to a 7. And if you need a 7, you have to roll a 6, and then on that 6, you have to roll a second 6. So it just makes everything work really well. You have a lot of good interactions there. So like, I'm going to move this unit forward 6 inches, and then I'm going to shoot. I'm -1 for moving, and you're in long range, so I'm an additional -1. So I'm hitting on 5s. I get 10 shots. I roll my dice. And then every shot that hits, I collect those dice. And then it's what type of unit is that? Oh, it's regular infantry. I'm wounding on 4s. So it's one of those where everybody has the same basic stats. There's no, my 1 unit is worth 5 of your dudes, because that's one of the things that I had talked about with some of my players with 40K, is that like some of these armies are not super balanced when you look at them like unit by unit. Like 100 points of intercessors is way more powerful than 100 points of orcs. It just is, because of the way statistically it breaks down. It's just silly. 100 points of orcs is 11 orcs, 12 orcs, somewhere in there, because they're 8 points each. Um, you know, so you get 11 wounds. 100 points of intercessors, you get 10 wounds. But with the orcs, you have a 6-up save, and the intercessors, depending on what turn it is, are just going to ignore it. So like the whole unit by unit like point comparison is, I don't know. It's real weird with 40k. Whereas with these two games, because everybody is basically the same in terms of base stats, it's all pretty balanced. You know, you're all humans at the end of the day, and so you all have the same basic stats. And then whatever army you take is what determines what like unique benefits you get. Now, I served in the 101st, so of course I picked U.S. because I wanted to make a bunch of airborne, 101st airborne. I was like, hell yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And then I found out that the U.S. has a very similar play style to what I play most things as, and that's just a lot of moving, moving up the board. So, but no, it's super fun game. Wound rolls, and then every wound roll that wounds, you just take a model off. There's no armor save. But it's also hard to wound people in this game because it's hard to hit people in this game. Like, you have to have perfect conditions in order to get that hitting on 3s. And you can actually hit on 2s, but you have to be at point blank range, which is within 6 inches. So it's just really interesting how that works out. And then there's tanks, which are gross, like infantry guns, just can't hurt them. Can't. Like, if I hit you with a submachine gun and you're in a Sherman, for example, not going to matter. My submachine gun isn't going to do anything to your Sherman. That being said, you're limited on how many tanks you can bring, depending on like what mission you go. And I haven't looked into the force building outside of the reinforced platoon, but everything I've seen generally just runs reinforced platoons unless a scenario allows for something different. And that's just like you're limited to one of these, 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 and then you have to bring some of this. The game puts a lot of emphasis on infantry, which is what I like. It's one of the reasons I play orcs and guard, really, because that's the other army I really got big into was the Astra Militarum, or Imperial Guard, for us old heads. So it's one of those where a lot of emphasis on infantry. Like, I think I've got 30 infantry on the board and then just a handful of other things. They're not big games. They take maybe an hour or two. Conflict 47 brings in some weird war stuff. And it has some different and new mechanics. Some of your reactions are different in Conflict 47. All your basic orders and stuff are all the same. It introduces mechs, Tesla weapons, werewolves. I think the Nazis get zombies. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff going on in that game, and I'm really pumped to get into it. And like I said, because it's a lot more balanced, I can approach it a lot more casually without having to, like, worry about somebody just bringing a more powerful list. That's, again, doing it, and I'm not trying to compare it to 40k, because in some ways they're totally different games. But if we do compare it to 40k, one of the things about 40k is that, like, because there's so many tryhards and because the game is unbalanced, you get a lot of dudes who just sit there watching battle reports and YouTube and meta chasing and having the internet tell them how to play their army. So then you have to just constantly figure out how to beat the meta with what you have. And if you can't beat the meta with what you have, you're just not going to win. And I don't like playing that way. I want people to be able to play whatever they want to play and still feel like they can be moderately competitive. And a perfect example of that would be like the state of Tau right now, which I will cover much more in depth in a later episode, because that's one of the things I think Tau players and Marine players are struggling with right now, is they have to relearn how to play the game. But Tau are in kind of a weird spot right now. I've had people... One of my Tau players is constantly being told, I don't know what you're complaining about. Tau were super good in 8th edition. Well, yeah, they were, as long as you took 3 riptides. You know, you should not be in a game as diverse as 40K. You should not be basically handcuffed to running one list if you want to win. And if that's the case, then one of two things is going on. You either have a bunch of douchebag tryhards who are trying to shit all over everybody with their internet lists and they're net decking their whole army, or the army's not that good unless you run that one specific thing. And it's probably some combination of the two. Obviously you could run 9 broadsides and that'd be gross too, but you still run into the same issue, because that's effectively just 3 riptides, because you're just relying on volumes of shots. It's silly that you would ever have to get to that point. Like, this is what I have to do if I want to win. And the issue you run into too is at 9th edition, and again, I'm getting off on a tangent, you'll figure this out quickly, I do that. The issue with 9th edition, and I think the issue that Marine and Tau players specifically are running into, is that you can't just rely on tabling people. But again, I'll cover that more later. But yeah, so the game is a lot more balanced. You don't have to worry about people net decking stuff. Like, you'll still get people who shitbag it, and they'll just go, oh, I'm going to take these terror-inducing tanks and just force morale checks all the time, because that's what the internet told me to do. But even that stuff is limited, because there's ways around it, so it's like, okay, cool. And you don't have to have a tank to kill a tank. You just have to have an anti-tank weapon. And even if you just have infantry with anti-tank bombs, generally speaking, you're going to be okay. You are not helpless if you're not. What's the word I'm looking for? You're not helpless if you don't bring a tank to a tank fight. And a good example of that was the first game I learned how to play. The guy I was playing with, Alex, brought an armored car. And the armored car, it was scary. It wasn't, but when I first saw it on the board, it was scary. I was just like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can handle this. The only thing I have on the board that can really hurt it is, I think my light machine gun had a +1 pen, so I would need a 6. And then I had a bazooka team. Fortunately, my bazooka team hit him the first time, I think it was, I shot him. And then he got disabled. And then I had just stacked pin counter upon pin counter upon pin counter on him. So I think he had like 5 pin counters, so that when he did activate again, he basically wanted to spend his turn rallying. And then once he rallied, I was able to shoot him again with the bazooka, and that time I popped him. So it was nice to see that, like, a bazooka team, for example, could hold its own. Like, they could do a thing. I did not have to have an armored car or some kind of vehicle to counter his vehicle. And, I could infantry spam in this game if I wanted to, and it wouldn't be busted, but it also wouldn't be shitty. I could go either way. So, I haven't gotten to play any Conflict 47 yet, because I'm on quarantine and I just started looking into it. My time has been spent painting, modeling, building terrain, paying bills, and doing all the admin stuff. So hopefully the next 10 to 12 days are not too painful. I get cabin fever pretty easily. That's one of the issues I have, is just not liking to be inside all the time. I have to sneak out for walks, and I have to mask up and everything, and I'm just out walking, and I try to do it before any other people are out, and I've got my little mask and my hood and stuff on. I should get my test results today, but I'm positive that I have it, because I can't taste anything and I can't smell anything. That's not 100% true. I'm getting hints of flavors occasionally. Like, my coffee really just tastes like coffee flavored water at this point. And then I was getting, like, I can get hints of acidic stuff, like some citrus and stuff like that. But like my eggs this morning, it was just like eating a sponge. Yeah, it was not, like, meh. Didn't get anything out of that. Did not enjoy it. Did not enjoy it. Got done, was like, oh, that was good. And then I was like, I still don't taste anything. So that was pretty cool. Fortunately, so far, though, it hasn't hit me too hard. other than the taste and the smell. And if that's the worst thing that happens, like, I'm gonna be okay with this. But yeah, I think that's where we're gonna wrap up today. I am, as you can tell, a little bit scatterbrained. That's just kind of me. Not that I'm scatterbrained, but like I'm all over the place and I get on tangents and so sometimes I need to rein it back in. But that's where we're gonna stop for today. I've got a merch store if you're interested. It is slowly growing. I design all the shirts. It's all me. It's all done in house, and it's at teespring.com/stores/VORPAL hyphen gaming. So that's teespring.com/stores/Vorpal hyphen gaming. And we also have a Patreon, but I'm not going to drop that just yet. I don't feel like I've earned the right to ask you for that yet. I feel like that's something I am going to need a couple episodes to get out, and then I'll go ahead and start posting that. Because at least with the merchandise, you're getting a thing. I don't feel like I've earned the right to ask you for money for listening to me talk. I feel like you and I, we need more rapport and we need a better relationship before I can ask that of you. So, that being said, I think next week we're going to cover some of the new releases, from Games Workshop, which it was, oh my goodness, what was it? Some silly stuff. Some Blood Bowl stuff, I do remember that. Outside of that, and some Necromunda stuff. It was the Bansars, I think it was, the Artificer, House of Artifice. And then it's like the Skaven dice and cards for the new set, and one of the other dice and cards for the new set. So just some re-releases, really, more than anything. But cool. If you got any questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitter at 2nerds Chris. And then I've got a podcast or a blog. I mean, obviously I have a podcast. You're listening to it. And a blog, 2nerds.vorpalgaming.com. So you can find some of my writing there. And that's it. I appreciate you guys listening. You have a great week.